I want to give 2 or 3 simple facts. This Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River, with Oregon on the south side of the river and Washington on the north, when fully completed, will produce 580,000 horsepower of electricity, which will give us more wealth, better living, and greater happiness for our children.
When President Franklin Roosevelt dedicated Bonneville Dam, the federal government had taken its first step toward a grand vision to put to widest use the power of America's mightiest Pacific River. With half a century of history gone over the old dam, that power is widely used indeed. This film was made to remind all of us who benefit from it of what it took to make that vision true. This is a salute to the pioneers and builders of that vision, and to the river that made it happen. In the 1830s, a fur trading expedition under U.S. Army Captain Benjamin Bonneville first surveyed the headwaters of the river that Lewis and Clark had followed to the Pacific. Bonneville's reports guided thousands who crossed the divide to the tributaries of a watershed larger than France. Trappers and wagon trail pioneers, loggers, farmers, railroaders, industrialists, and engineers came and marveled at the riches of the land and the power of the rivers. Newcomers still marvel today. The Columbia gathers many waters. Some begin on the slopes of the Cascades, volcanic peaks strung along 500 miles of the Pacific Rim. Some among granite crags of the Rockies along an inland arc from Yellowstone to Canadian ice fields. The Columbia returns the snows from heights nearly 3 miles above the sea and descends through a country of dramatic contrasts. Most of the river's central valley is a high desert basin, lying in rain shadow between the mountain chains. Here, the ancient engines of earth and fire, of air and water, have worked on a titanic scale. And in just the latest eye blink of geologic time, the hands and machines of human beings have shaped the landscape too. Again and again along its way, the river's current is restrained. And from these man-made waterfalls, another, more disciplined current flows. Strongest at its source, it moves outward through its branches, a river in reverse. Like the Columbia, the stream of electricity defines and extends the unique vitality of the Pacific Northwest. This is, as always, lumber country. It's farm country, beef country, aluminum country, exporting country. It's also vacation country, people country. Newcomers in growing numbers are still being drawn to the Columbia region in search of its space, its work, its beauty, and opportunities for the outdoor life. Only one lifespan ago, many Easterners still thought of this as a remote and backward region, a place where natural resources could be extracted. But in fact, the Northwest was already pioneering a new technology that would become the symbol of the young 20th century. Remnants of early hydro-generating systems can still be seen on smaller streams in the region. They testify to how long a time it was that the big river defied control. But the promise of massive hydropower couldn't be denied. The Columbia would be harnessed within the span of a single human generation. It was a time of extraordinary change. It began on the other side of the Continental Divide, in the Mississippi Basin.
It's a mighty hard road that my poor hand has hold. My poor feet has traveled a hot, dusty road. Out of your dust bowl and westward we rolled, and your desert was hot and your mountains was cold. California and Arizona, I make all your crops, and it's north up to Oregon to gather your hops. On the edge of your city,
The Dust Bowl refugees arrived to find the lumber market had collapsed too. They joined the workers and tradesmen of the Northwest on the street. People were asking, with all there is to be done in this rich, blessed country, why can't we find work? The federal government responded. There would be work, public works, and on a grand scale. Wasn't it time to do something about the Columbia River?
Uncle Sam, he took the challenge in the year of 33 for the farmers and the workers and for all humanity.
Construction workers responded to the call of the Army's Corps of Engineers.
But while you're rambling, River, you can do some work for me.
Down to the river gorge, too, came seasoned electric utility professionals, revitalized bureaucrats, government filmmakers, and a young folk singer named Woody Guthrie.
Cascade Rapids men have labored day and night, matched their strength against the river in its wild and reckless fight.
And in September 1937, the era of federal power in the Northwest began.
Uncle Sam will find its power where the river meets the sky. Roll, Columbia, won't you?
And now, my friends, I'm going to press a button, and that will start everything going. Here it is.
With the dam generating power, a brand new federal agency went to work. The Bonneville Power Administration would market federal electricity, take it right off the Corps of Engineers powerhouse, and wholesale it to public utilities and private power companies who would retail it to users. BPA crews began to build a transmission network that would grow to 15,000 miles. The first were the hardest, just struggling out of the gorge. Where it was too steep for vehicles to carry cross arms and insulators, mules were sent. Where mules couldn't go, men went. Even where the going was easy, distances were great. Sometimes after nightfall, the next day's tower location was marked line of sight with the headlights of the foreman's cars. Mile by mile, BPA's pioneers stitched the slender lines of the new river of power together, off the Columbia and across the land. But how much power could a sparsely populated, mostly rural market absorb? Service was far from universal in the countryside, and even the few farmers who had electricity used it sparingly. It was costly. A key provision of BPA's charter law guaranteed that preference in access to federal power would go to publicly owned utilities and to the new rural electric cooperatives. The government's aim was to sell power at what it cost to make and create a wide market. Remarkably quickly, it did. When hydropower reached the farm, it brought more than electric lights. It brought motors to ease the heavy chores. It retired the wood-fired stove. It brought refrigeration. Best of all, it brought a pump. No more bucket baths on the porch, no more cold outhouse. Running water. It was even more welcome than those lights in the barn. Things were looking up.
Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. At Bonneville now there is ships and no locks. Waters have arisen and drowned at the rocks. Shiploads of plenty will steam in the docks. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on.
Upstream from Bonneville in the desert east of the Cascades, an even bigger plan was underway. The basin is basaltic rock, the product of ancient volcanoes. The river cuts through a layered plateau that was built up of massive lava flows over several million years. Early French explorers of the basin noted the most prominent feature in this landscape, a deep coulee or canyon, many miles long. Along its course, a string of narrow lakes often gives it the appearance of a river. Geologists say that once it was. For a brief, violent period, this was the main channel of the Columbia. During the Ice Age, the Columbia flowed in its westerly course across the upper basin, with a volume of water many times that of today, fed by an ice sheet covering half the continent. One of the glaciers pinched off the river and diverted it south. The ice-swollen torrent gouged out a new channel. Before the ice dam yielded and the river returned to its course, it roared in a cataract greater than any now on Earth and left the evidence of its passing behind. This is the evidence, the place now called Dry Falls. The quiet blue lake at the base of the cliffs is 200 feet deep. Some think the Columbia poured from these cliffs for only a few days. Early in this century, an attorney from a basin farm town and a newspaper man from the orchard country began to promote a big idea: to do with a concrete dam what nature had done with ice. It would just have to be the biggest dam in the world. That was all. Some idea. Visionary. But people kept bringing it up.
We settled down on some cut-over land and pulled up the brush and the stumps by hand. The sun burnt up my first crop of wheat and the river down the canyon just 500 feet. Might as well have been 50 miles. Good land. Grow anything you plant if you can get the moisture. Now, what we need is a great big dam to throw a lot of water out across that land. People could work and the stuff would grow and you could wave goodbye to the old Skid Row.
Grand Coulee Dam. Even in a time of enthusiasm for colossal public works, the audacity of this one astounded everybody who saw it. This dam was going to hold back a river lake 160 miles long. More than 12 billion tons of water, they said. Part of that water would go to those dry farms. The rest of it could run through turbines. There sure could be a lot of electricity, and it sure would be cheap. Building 2 dams and the power lines that connected them to the major cities took only half a dozen years. It had been done in the very nick of time. The United States was at war, and the Northwest was ready. Aluminum smelters had already come to the Columbia for its hydropower. Now BPA hooked up the plants directly to the Bonneville Coulee grid, and the lightweight Wonder Metal rolled. Vast quantities of fully mobilized hydropower put thousands of fighters and bombers in the air and built some of the greatest of the Northwest's industrial capacities virtually overnight. The Columbia's power ran arc welders at 24-hour-a-day yards in Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington, building ships for the Pacific War. Some of Coulee's kilowatts went out over lines BPA crews suddenly had to run to a hush-hush new facility in the desert at a place called Hanford. Afterwards, the engineers learned what the mystery load had produced: a small quantity of something called plutonium for the weapons that ended the war. The post-war Pacific Northwest had come of age. Its aluminum and lumber industries turned to the needs of a nationwide housing boom. At Grand Coulee, the Bureau of Reclamation turned to the other purpose of its multi-purpose dam. The breakthrough vision of the Coulee project was that with its own electricity, the Columbia could pump itself up the last few hundred feet and over the canyon wall. Just as Woody Guthrie had wished it, the great big dam was finally throwing water out across that land. By this time, BPA had been throwing transmission lines across the land for more than 10 years, and the basin farmers were ready for a new day on new land. As if by a miracle, the great Columbia River had suddenly changed its course to run right past the end of the rows. More than 500,000 acres came to life. In the year the first harvest came in from the irrigated basin, the lower river city of Vanport was swept away. 2 dams had harnessed the Columbia, but not tamed it. A film made after the 1948 flood shows that the government already had plans for what to do next.
If we are to control the restless Columbia, we must first develop. Bonneville and Grand Coulee are only the beginning. Tame the hazardous rapids. Government engineers say it can be done. And water power is the magic partner in making
At Bridgeport, Washington, the $100 million Chief...
Soon, the newsreels had new power dam dedications to cover.
Added control on the Columbia River's mighty flood time surges. Power for decades of growth. And
Through the 1950s, county public utility districts, investor-owned utilities, and the government's Corps of Engineers invested billions in more dams. Nobody called them boondoggles anymore. Dams had proved themselves. Who could argue?
An Indian chief takes a last look at a spectacle that's been going on for 100 years, but soon will be history. Jalilo Falls on the Columbia River will soon be underwater. A huge new dam has been built at the Dalles, downstream from the falls.
In some ways, building dams was irresistible. Clean, cheap power. Better than anything else. Vast benefits. The law said that BPA would pay back to the Treasury with interest every penny that the hydropower complex cost. But sometimes money wasn't the only cost. Almost 10 million kilowatts of hydropower was now on the lines. Besides federal power from federal dams, BPA was carrying locally owned public and private electricity as well. Its high-voltage grid was the best way to move power around, from virtually any place with a surplus to places with high demand. But surplus power became more and more rare. In September 1963, President Kennedy came to the Hanford Nuclear Reservation to break ground for the region's first nuclear power plant. And he touched on several themes that would echo through 2 decades.
So I want us to stay ahead. You know that in the next 10 years, I hope the people of the United States realize it, that we double the need for electric power every 10 years. We need the equivalent of a new Grand Coulee Dam every 60 days. We must construct efficient interconnections between electric systems and between regions, as has been proposed by means of a Pacific Northwest, Pacific Southwest intertie. Maybe we can give some of it to California.
Clearly, the time for big plans on the Columbia was not over. If the Northwest grid was going to send power outside the region, much more water would have to be stored upstream. In 1964, the U.S. agreed to finance large storage dams on the Canadian Columbia and buy their excess hydropower. The completion of British Columbia's Mica Dam and others in the river's upper valleys greatly increased the average usable flow in the United States. The spillway at Mica became an upstream control for Grand Coulee hundreds of miles below. Franklin D. Roosevelt Lake was no longer the only catch basin for spring snowmelt, nor the biggest lake on the Columbia. But now a third powerhouse could be carved into the solid rock of the right bank, and 8 new turbines could double the dam's output. By the time the new Coulee powerhouse came onto the grid, the problem was that the largest single source of electrical power in the world wasn't enough. All the dams together didn't seem to be enough. It looked like the fully electrified and electricity-dependent Northwest wouldn't be exempt from years of energy crisis. In the 1970s, the Northwest power grid began to carry new megawatts of thermal power from plants whose turbines were driven with steam. Like most of the country, this region was now making a lot of electricity from coal and uranium. At Hanford, nuclear power technology stands side by side with the Columbia. A working plant fulfills the dream hailed in the 60s of a clean, inexhaustible source of energy. Less than a mile away stands an unfinished plant, a reminder that the future of the nuclear power option remains uncertain. But the flexibility of the grid allows existing different technologies to work together. The Trojan nuclear plant typically produces a steady million-plus kilowatts for 10 months at a time. While its reactor is refueled, its customers can get a lot of their power from Bonneville Dam. Bonneville is still going strong into its 50s, with the original cost repaid as of 1987. Its new powerhouse is an investment that's younger than any nuclear plant in the Northwest. Bonneville keeps earning. A lot of what it earns goes into restoring some of the more delicate balances of the Columbia River. We've learned a lot about those balances, and our best teacher was the region's most admired native. The Pacific salmon was the pride of the region in 1937. Federal hydro planners cared about them from the beginning, when Bonneville's world-famous fish ladders were built. But at the beginning, no one knew just how much care salmon would need. Over the years, the answer became clear: much more. In 1980, Congress passed the Northwest Power Act, a sweeping measure that created a new framework, and the Northwest Power Planning Council to help reconcile the region's interests in power, money, quality of life, and the claims of nature. The act also gave BPA a broad mission to manage Northwest power and the natural resources affected by it in balance. Using its revenues from the sale of federal electricity, BPA funds one of the world's largest efforts to mitigate the impact of power facilities on fish and wildlife. On tributary streams where some of the region's oldest small dams obstruct salmon runs, BPA builds fish ladders. It doesn't matter that the old dam never was federal property, or that it's been here since before Bonneville. What matters is that salmon can again reach clear shallows, where none have spawned for most of this century. Through 1990, the commitment of the region's ratepayers in support of fish totals nearly $1 billion. Other wildlife habitats are being studied and improved. In the basin, where the pressure of underground water from dam impoundments forms new kinds of wetlands. In the mountains, where the habitat of bighorn sheep is being enhanced. And where transmission towers are modified, so eagles won't be accidentally electrocuted. In the late 80s, the network stretched a new line eastward across the Continental Divide. These days, helicopters do much of the work once done by men and mules. But somebody still has to climb the towers, and it's still the kind of work you can't do if you're afraid to look down. The Trans-Divide line links generating plants near the vast coal resources of Montana and Wyoming to customers on the Pacific side of the divide. Major lines like this one operate at 500,000 volts. Insulators keep such lines some 10 feet from any metal structure in the open air. But inside this switching station in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, the circuits safely run through a maze of 36-inch tubes filled with an insulating gas. This technology makes it possible to get a critical station out of the weather in a compact space. This station can be run by a single operator. The Celilo station above the Dalles has a more conventional outdoor yard and a larger crew. It's the northern terminus of the DC intertie to the power grid of California. Inside is an example of BPA's continuing technical pioneering. This room can't be entered by anything as frail as a human being when the device being inspected here is energized. This solid-state DC valve converts alternating current to 1 million volts of direct current. DC is the more efficient way to send power over long distances, and from Celilo to the Los Angeles grid is an 846-mile unbroken run. Such concern for efficiency is a healthy legacy of the 1970s. Even as the great river produces low-cost electricity, successful conservation efforts help ensure that reserve generating capacity is adequate well into the next century. From Canada to the sea, the Columbia is monitored and managed. In a hydropower system, only the hydro can be stored. So water is electricity for tomorrow. That makes it tomorrow's cash flow for BPA, tomorrow's repayment on the taxpayer investment in hydropower, and tomorrow's money for improving the river and its environment. Not much water goes to the sea unused. Water over a dam is being spilled for a good reason and no more than necessary. Besides power and irrigation, there are a lot of other things we need to do with this fundamental wealth. It's released to assist the migration of fish, to regulate the river between here and the next dam downstream, to maintain its recreational shoreline, and to maintain 300 miles of river for navigation. Those who brought a trickle of Northwest hydropower to a flood of progress know that the river is the source of it all. And the Columbia keeps bringing more. Every winter, it snows. Every spring, it melts. And the rivers run. In every season, the Columbia delivers its wealth. To a fisherman who thinks of the river as a friend. To a vacationer who thinks of it as a playground. And the industry that uses it as a highway. To users of electricity anywhere between the Yukon and the Mexican border, who know of it as a servant. The 1930s vision of a river of power is largely complete. What began at Grand Coulee and here at Bonneville succeeded. And because of that, the Northwest has gained the wisdom and the means to preserve its splendid resources of water, of earth, and air, and the river of power they make possible for as long as the Columbia rolls.